Vanity URLs, promo codes, surveys, now pixel tracking. Tracking and attribution has become practically mandatory in the podcast space in recent years. The need for data and a better understanding of performance has grown as the needs of advertisers have become more sophisticated. In episode 7 of On the Mic with Ad Results Media, we learned a bit about the history and new technology surrounding podcast attribution when we sat down with our very own Andrea Schwarzbach and CEO Marshall Williams. Today, we are excited to bring you a follow-up episode to that conversation as we interview the founder and CEO of the pixel-based podcast attribution startup company Podsights, Sean Creeley. So let's get started.
Who's actually buying ads, and then we moved into the reporting side. That's not the problem. The problem is attribution. Like we just can't figure out if this stuff works. We are growing faster than I thought we would, to be honest with you.
Should I start it off with a kazoo? Should I start the podcast off with a kazoo?
Yeah, could you?
Do you have one?
I do. Of course I do. Is this wrong end?
Makes me so happy. Just the ridiculousness of it. I don't know.
Well, Sean, thank you for agreeing to join us on today's episode. I'm sure a lot of our listeners actually know who you are since we do draw in more of the audio advertising crowd. But if you don't mind introducing yourselves for those who don't, that would be awesome.
Hi, I'm Sean from Podsights. We do podcast attribution for brands and agencies.
Can you actually break down how Podsights came to be and how it works, and kind of explain it to me as if I've never heard it before?
Sure. So podcasting is a very interesting medium in that it's not radio, but it's also not digital, in that we have some digital signals like downloads and user agents and households, that kind of things. And we have brand pixels that, much like Facebook pixels or Twitter pixels, like what they use on the digital side to do attribution, but it's not sort of the same as digital in that we don't have user identifiers. The best we can do is household level data. So how it came about is that we started building tools on the research side, right? Like who's actually buying ads. And then we moved into the reporting side, like how many downloads are these agencies getting? And then we talked to people like from ad results and et cetera. And they're like, that's not the problem. The problem is attribution. Like we just can't figure out if this stuff works. There's a lot of people that have made, a lot of good investment decisions in podcast marketing very early on through discount codes and, low CPMs and all these other fun things. And they figured out it was working. But as the industry expands here, it's no longer a small market, right? It will be $1 billion, and then it will be 2, and then it will be 3, and then, sky's the limit kind of thing. And to entice some of these advertisers that, can't use discount codes or vanity URLs are just notoriously inaccurate for a lot of advertisers, pixel-based attribution seems to be what works. And that's not to say that people don't have success otherwise, but what we have found is that in order to sort of validate that podcast is working for a brand and then to sort of increase scale, test it to new networks and to new shows, the pixel-based attribution methodology works well for sort of making brands comfortable with a very different medium than a lot are used to.
I'm sure this isn't something that you kind of dreamed of doing since you were like 10 years old, starting a podcast attribution platform. How did you kind of get to the point where you decided to create this? Was there some major event that motivated you? What was like your background before? Was it in attribution? Was it in research? Or tell us a little more about that.
It's in tech startups. This is my second startup. The first one was called Embedly. It was in the media space. So we worked with people like Reddit, and LinkedIn, and Salesforce, and Microsoft to basically build the functionality that, like, if you paste a URL into a text box, it automatically expands into the video. In general, I like solving problems. I like sort of building tech solutions to solve them and working on sort of small teams that start something from just sort of the idea phase into sort of a full-blown product. Podcasting wasn't on my radar, to be completely honest with you. We were in social retargeting. We found that interesting, just watching buddies like spend a ton on Facebook and Twitter and doing absolutely no optimization and just saying like, we'll let them handle it. that was a bad idea. And we wasted like 6 months. And then I was in a bar drinking with a buddy, and he was like, hey, podcasting. He was in market research, and he was like, basically, we know that our brand should get into podcasting, but we have no idea who's even in podcasting. And then it just starts sort of that cascade of following into it, right? Where you go from one step, okay, let's just see who's in advertising, and then talk to them and figure out what their problems are, and then talk to them, the agencies and the brands and et cetera. So it took us a solid year and a half to get really any traction. And then once the traction hit and people like, ad results started saying like, hey, these guys might know what they're doing, that's when, we started to grow. And from a benefit side of things, like what was the decision that ad results made? I mean, why were they like, okay, this attribution thing isn't going to be just a flash in the pan. Like we view this as something that's going to be in the industry for a while. Like what was the change there?
Yeah. So I think our agency as a whole, we've always known that podcast and radio both probably do a lot better than what we give them credit for, or than what our clients give them credit for. So I think being able to measure that from like an attribution perspective, where we can actually have, here's a download and here's a person that went to your website and checked out, is huge, right? We've never been able to have that kind of data before on podcasting. It's really just coupon code or a vanity URL. Some of our clients don't even have that. A lot of them just don't have offers, and so they can't do a code, but some of them only measure by survey, and some of them really can't measure on a show by show level.
Because if you're on 80 shows, right, or run a network kind of thing, like you're not going to have a list of 80 podcasts to say which one do you get this on, right?
Well, some people do that. Like we have clients that do that, where there's a drop down list of shows and you have to go and pick it.
Think of the user behavior behind that. Like how dedicated you have to be to a show to like scroll to especially if it's a Z title podcast.
Right. Which is something that we've kind of seen is there are shows that people are such dedicated listeners to that host that they will scroll for days to find that host name just to make sure that that host gets the credit. But then, yeah, there's a lot of other shows where there may not be that listener to host relationship that you can foster through listening to a host over and over again. Limited series, for example, where it's like shows that a random season, it's a random host, no one really knows the host, you don't get to know them, they're just telling you a story. You don't really feel any kind of obligation or loyalty to that host, so you don't really care about scrolling through 80 names to find that show. But like if you listen to Joe Rogan, you want to give Joe Rogan credit. So attribution kind of helps us, and we saw the potential there of being able to show all of our clients that it works better than we think it does, and gives us even more data on a show by show or even network level of what's actually working and what's driving volume to their site and conversions.
Yeah, I mean, that's somewhat how we think about it as well, is specifically relative, right? Like it doesn't make one show, one advertiser doesn't make a whole ton of sense to spin up Podsights and the attribution and pixel base, right? Because it takes up a lot of time. But specifically when you're doing cross publisher or a large network, it makes a ton of sense to figure out, because not all these shows are created equal. Some are going to work bangers for some brands, and some just aren't, right? And specifically when we start talking about like overlap between publishers, like how does that sort of play? And we've done studies here where it's really nice to have on multiple people saying your name, right? It's not like Joe Rogan's sort of the outlier, and we hate talking about him because, like, honestly, like, he can sell cow shit and people are going to buy it, right? But there's sort of the network-wide things where we need to think about, like, how do we sort of scale advertising here? Because at the end game, like, our goal is to make podcast advertising bigger, right? There's still a ton of unsold inventory. There's still a lot of shows and smaller podcasters that are not getting paid as much as they should be, just because they're basically trying to have to find advertiser after advertiser and churn, et cetera. So from a pixel-based side of things, yeah, like that's something we talk about a lot, is optimizing, scaling, really validating the investment in the space. From a more tactical side, I mean, I think you've seen this before, but the setup isn't as bad as a lot of people make it out to be, right? So how sort of attribution works in general is we have integrations with all the hosting providers. There's what's called a tracking URL for the dynamic insertion. So if you're doing run of network or run of show, it's server to server side. For some of the smaller independent guys, we have what's called an analytics prefix that the host installs. Sort of very simple, very easy. And then it's it's just a pixel on the brand side of things. So we're not, which can be done as, smaller shops can be done in a matter of 15 minutes. For larger shops, where there's, it can take a matter of days, but, the lift isn't that hard. And then what we do is basically match households. So it's not user level attribution, it's panel based, right? In that we have had numerous conversations about, noisy IPs versus corporate IPs versus cell towers and everything else along those lines. But, basically 50% of all downloads happen at a household, and then we get nice data there where we can say someone at this household visited the brand site after being exposed to an ad, and then we do a lot of modeling after that to say, well, what does the rest of the space, the IP users that we just can't do any attribution for, how do we think they're going to interact with the site? And that's how we come up with sort of a modeling behavior after that. So it's not. Some of the survey-based ones and some of the discount URL code ones are, we just apply a random multiplier. As from a methodology standpoint, like it's the same whether it's one campaign versus the other, which sort of makes it a little bit easier to do some of the validation and what shows are working and what do we need to sort of rotate out.
So you just said, did you say 50% on average?
Yeah. It used to be, so like pre-COVID, it was 30%. We'd see sometimes it would be larger multipliers. Post-COVID, we were seeing a lot of people stay home, which is good, and therefore sort of the attribution actually gets better. And things like smart speakers, for example, that are actually tied to the household, we have that's more information that we can use there. And by the way, smart speakers do really well, right? Because they just work. So I would buy smart speakers if I were you.
I'm surprised it's not more than 50% with everyone working from home. Like, is that kind of how it's balanced back out, since some places and some cities are going back to work?
No, we didn't see it come down to 100% of people staying at home, right? Because people, essential workers, et cetera, there's still a lot of commutes going on. There's still people walking around, which is, in outdoor spaces. We did a bunch of studies here that around, COVID and downloads like everybody else did. Sort of there was a decay and now it's coming back up and all those other fun stuff. But it's, it's from our standpoint, like we're not trying to shame people for not staying home and downloading more podcasts, right? So maybe we should be, who knows?
So since launching Podsights, you guys launched a little over a year ago, maybe longer, but I know we started working with you guys a little over a year ago.
Yeah, exactly. It's, basically we've been around since 2018, but July 2019 is when we sort of really got going.
So what's been the most surprising thing that you've learned since starting Podsights?
Podcasting is a mess, right? It's not as simple as, I just give Google some money and I get some search ads or there's a massive display network that, RTB bidding and all those other fun stuff where, I can be on 1,000 different sites for digital, right? Like it's on a case by case, it's a one by one. So most of podcasting is just people issues, right? It's not actually a lot of technology some of the times, right? So if you're running a campaign across 10 different publishers, it can be 10 different hosting companies, it can be 10 different sales teams. I mean, a lot of it is still like RFP gets sent out, people reply to it, like it's not as sophisticated as some of the digital clients. And there's obviously a lot of pros there, right? In that the medium is way more authentic because of it. So when we went out and started building it, we were basically like, okay, well, eventually this is all going to be, some big ad server somewhere that is going to own it. And that was surprising to me and how diverse the space is, and it's all over the place. It's not like sort of New York and there's hubs all over the place, which is super interesting for us. We are growing faster than I thought we would, to be honest with you. Attribution in general is the space has sort of really taken off in the last year or so, right? As the hosting providers got better, as some of the we and a few other people came into the space and said, like, this is actually something that should be solved, and the market got big enough, right? You can't have sort of a venture-backed business in sort of smaller markets, and it's really hard. It would have been really hard to basically start Podsights without VC capital, because of the fact that, like, you have to wait a long time. It's like 2 years in order for us to get somewhere near and you need a lot of engineering talent in order to make that happen as well. But the industry has progressed, and it's very similar in some ways to how digital progressed too, and that you had sort of a lot of small publishers, and there's obviously going to be some consolidation. You've seen that around Spotify and Liberty Media, et cetera. But there's still sort of this nice world of sort of the independents and individual publishers that we like to see, at least. And from a buying perspective, right, it gives you a ton of options.
Yeah. And so it really has blown up in the past year. I mean, we've seen other vendors pop up too. So how do you think about staying competitive with everything still so new, with, you guys are still, I think you guys have your dashboard in a really good spot, but you're still constantly changing and evolving. And
I mean, that's how we do it, right? Is that we got here, fairly early. Our whole job is not, again, because of people problems, et cetera. Like, a lot of what we invest in is we invest in account management and partnerships, and making sure that when someone comes in the front door, that they know exactly what to expect, that they have a team, because it's not like, digital, where you can just spin up a dashboard. Like, there's a lot of explaining things to go through, and, on the methodology, et cetera. From a product standpoint, yeah, I mean, it's constantly just taking feedback and iterating, right? It's building things for people that you wouldn't have thought of. And I think that's what I like most about sort of building tech startups, right? Is that once you have sort of that initial user base, the product basically builds itself, right? As long as you're smart about it. It's taking sort of that feedback and saying, okay, like, how do we not build some one-off for one different client, but make it so that we solve the issue, but it works for 10 clients, and then go sell 10 more clients and go figure out their problems, and et cetera. So it's constantly evolving, right? We went from sort of measuring a single campaign to measuring multiple campaigns, doing incremental lift, to doing a lot of, overlap analysis and frequency and reach, et cetera. Never mind the ad pulling stuff and sort of analyzing some of the audio files. That sort of makes it sort of ground up podcast first. And that's sort of where we have done really well, is being podcast first. Some digital providers will come in and give you a pixel and say, hey, it's gonna, but podcasting is different in the fact that, like, there's no standard, and you're integrating with, on a case-by-case basis, with a lot of different hosting providers. Never mind, like, how do we even count a download, right? Well, I mean, I think that's always changed too, right? And mostly because of none of us control the player, which is interesting, right? Where you have sort of a vertically integrated product like Spotify. Spotify owns the player, they own the content, they own the ad insertion, et cetera. Like, you can get a little bit better on the things, but they just don't have the scale for that sort of inline thing. Most of their downloads come from third parties. And Apple just doesn't care about that for business, because they're a $2 trillion company now. And podcasting is a rounding area, but it's a nice app to have on the phone that's free content that anybody can see, that makes the sort of the platform a little more enticing. Again, our job is to sort of work within those constraints, and say, like, downloads, we don't feel that, like, getting within a percentage point of an impression number is all that important. What we think is the downstream metrics obviously matter, and I think that you guys have done a really nice job offering that to clients too. But even back in the discount codes and surveys, right? It's like, who cares about the number of impressions they're getting? Like, how many sales are they driving, and how much are we paying for the media, right? Because if that's positive, we should do more of that. If that's negative, we should do less of that. Which I think translates really well from the attribution side of things. So we try not to get into arguments with people and say, like, okay, well, it was actually 101 downloads versus 99. That is not an interesting argument to anybody, right? Like, what we care about is that it drove 5 purchases, and therefore, like, that was a good investment, and we should go and do that again.
Just talking about all of the constraints that you do have, what would you say has been your biggest challenge so far as a company?
Convincing people we weren't going to blow up their business, to be honest with you, right? A lot of people have made a lot of money in this space, like just, selling impressions, right? And then letting the brand figuring out whether it was going to work or not. And we had a hell of a time convincing the agencies and the brands in the first place, specifically the agencies, right? Because they're like, well, it's working right now. We're doing well. Like, we don't need, and we're still having that problem with a lot of different people saying, like, we're here to help, right? Are we going to show like that every single one of your show converts amazing? No, we're not. But what we continue to find is that a brand is less likely to churn if they have the information to improve. So even if their first campaign does not do all that well, right, they can go back with a whole, dashboard worth of data and say, like, okay, well, this little part did, right? And they're used to that, right? They're used to throwing 1,000 ads at a Facebook and saying, like, okay, this one worked really well. Let's go sort of figure out why it did really well, and then double down on that. And I think that's where we've sort of had our success, is like accidentally falling into one campaign with one brand and one agency, and then showing them sort of that sort of cycle, and then watching the brand react to that level of insights versus a spreadsheet after the fact that, like, that discount code got six purchases and we're going to give it a multiplier of 3.2 because of the survey, right? That's sort of a harder sell sometimes to make an agency or a brand, or specifically a brand, love the medium. We like dashboards. We like looking at things as humans, right? Like, it's just something that we do.
So I'm kind of curious, just because I'm more on the creative side over here at Ad Results, is there anything specific that stands out to you, like when you're looking at this data that's like, yep, that campaign absolutely killed it? Or like, what exactly would you be looking for that just stands out as like, this was absolutely successful?
Here's the problem, right? Like, where we think the agencies and brands well aligned is that they know the product, they know the numbers, they know everything about it. So they can look at a conversion rate or a sort of a CPA, et cetera, and say, like, this is working or this isn't, right? So there's some campaigns that we've done where it's, they've had horrible conversions rates, and the brand's like, yeah, nailed it. Like, because of the fact that, like, they're used to getting such low conversion rates on everything else that they do, that even though, like, we only drove 3 purchases, that 3 purchases just happen to be for a $3,000 product, and therefore it's ROI positive, and then we're good to go, right? Where we've had sort of from the creative side where we've had the most success is when brand messaging aligns with content. There's obviously, targeting helps for some of the dynamic inserted podcasts when you can target based off of either, you can't do male female, right? But you can try to do things around like health and wellness or IT decision makers, things like that. Sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. Most of it's around experimentation, and that's what we try to harp on is, ABC creative, pre-roll, mid-roll, don't buy post rolls. Make sure the frequency is on a reasonable scale. Some people shove you into a back catalog and you'll have a frequency of 100 and wonder why it's not doing all that well. Well, because no one's going to listen. Someone downloaded 100 episodes, but they're only going to listen to one of them. We tell people to buy first runs, whether it be dynamically inserted or embedded, right? First run is always going to do really well. Generally you can't come into this industry with $1,000 and buy some ads, right? Which sort of is not great for people that are used to Facebook advertising, where you can spend $1,000 and see some sort of ROI analysis. And you have to be in the 10 to 20 to 30 thousand in order to even get a clear sense of what's working and what's not. Because what you don't want to do is spend $5,000 on a sort of a back catalog because it's the cheapest thing, and then churn because you had no idea whether it worked or not. I skewed away from your creative question. I'm not sure that happens, but obviously endorsements are better than not endorsements, right? Even though we've seen some of the NPR style ads do really well, specifically some of the pre-roll stuff, because it's a consistent narrator, which is nice, versus sometimes where you'll see like the Geico commercials get dropped into the middle of a podcast, and like, what the hell are we even doing here, right? So those obviously do not work all that well. And then with increased scale, sort of lowers some of the conversion rates, because of the fact that you are reaching just a really broad audience, versus some of the narrowing that you can do on a show-by-show basis.
So I guess kind of the last question we have is just what's next?
Dre's going to tell me. I mean, some of that's it's honestly fairly true, right? Some of the times that we're going to see, we continue to see brands that are newer to the space that push us very interesting features that we can add to the product. I don't think that we're going to get to it's never like we're going to get more data, right? We're on the user. We're just not like you're never going to see those kind of insights come in. We're never going to know who actually downloaded the podcast, because none of this industry is vertically integrated, and that's actually a fairly decent thing. So it's a lot of what we're doing now is really just about how do we tell a brand an interesting story about how their campaign performed, and not just show them a line chart, because that's at the end of the day, everybody likes looking at graphs, but then the next question is like, now what, right? So we have now a data analyst that is dedicated on our team, that any brand can say like, hey, you need some help, and we'll sort of dig into them with it. We've added some of the lift reports for specific reasons, for more touch points, to say like, this is doing well, or this isn't doing well, and I think that's sort of important here. And then some of the optimization side of things. But at the end of the day, I mean, like, what we want to do is sort of allow people to be more always on, versus do one campaign, spend 3 months figuring out whether it worked, and then trying it again, right? Like we'd like to shorten that cycle, so it's 3 months on, a week to look at something, and then let's keep on going, because this is doing well and this isn't, and that discovery is obviously a problem that we continue to think about, like, how do we help brands even find podcasts to advertise on. Like, AdResults obviously has a massive database of all the back catalogs of everything that they've ever done, so they can say like, well, for these 8 shows, you should expect that thing, right? You don't. But we're starting to get benchmarks, right, which is really helpful for brands, so that when they're specifically with publisher sales, when they're trying to sell people into a podcast, they know like, okay, well, this is good, this is bad, from a conversion rate standpoint, which will help them sort of make better decisions about what to buy and what not to buy. Mostly Dre's going to tell me.
No pressure, Dre. No pressure.
Do my best.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe for updates on future episodes, and leave us a comment with your feedback, questions, or ideas for future segments. If you would like more info on AdResults Media and what we do, please visit us online at adresultsmedia.com. This podcast is an AdResults Media production.